It is September 22nd, 2025, and the United Nations General Assembly is gathering for its 80th session. And there are a lot of different plans here, including plans by Zelensky to get as close as possible to Trump and to try to talk some sense into him once again when it comes to future plans coming from Europe for so called security guarantees for Ukraine. Because whether it's plans for troops on the ground or plans for a 19th sanctions package that stands to further cut the bloc off from the rest of the world, there seems to be no end to the lengths that European politicians are willing to go to in order to keep the US happy. So, what does that mean for where tensions are headed? Well, we got into all of the latest with a special guest earlier, so let's take a listen to that conversation now. Joining me now to discuss is Glenn Diesen, a geopolitical analyst, author, and professor at the University of South-Eastern Norway. Professor Diesen, thanks so much for taking the time to join me.
Oh, thank you. It's my great pleasure.
Yeah, it's great to have you on the show again. Now, I want to get your take on the latest here. I know that this week, the United Nations General Assembly is holding its 80th session under the theme Better Together. And that's where Zelensky is planning to meet up with Trump and to really put pressure on him for more US sanctions against Russia and for support for security guarantees that could see European troops officially on the ground in Ukraine. How do you view the Trump administration's handling of the war in Ukraine so far? I mean, they certainly haven't ended it. It seems like they want to hand it off to Europe a little bit more, but at the same time, they're still desperately trying to profit from it.
Yeah, well, I think the consideration for Trump goes on many levels. The domestic politics is quite important. He promised his base that he would end the war, and but nonetheless, he seems to want to keep it going, at least to hand it over to the Europeans. So if the Europeans can keep the pressure up on Russia, and the U.S. can make some money of it, then he can I guess redefine some of his objectives in terms of ending the war. But again, it's we say United States, but the U.S. is split within. The policies of Trump towards Russia is not that popular within the United States, even among the Republicans. So it's never clear to me who is. He seems he's playing someone. So either he's trying to fool the Russians, or he's trying to fool his own hawks. It's he pursues what's referred to as strategic ambiguity. So this is very much calculated. My impression is that he's looking for a new division of labor where the Europeans will take care of Russia, balancing and weakening Russia, while keeping the conflict going also has the benefit of maintaining, I guess, some loyalty among the Europeans. Because at the moment, Europe will do whatever it takes to keep, the US interested in the old continent.
Yeah, it really does seem like Europe is just fighting for US approval, right? Whatever US says, when Trump wakes up one day and he goes, "Hey, we need you guys to start targeting China and India and all of these third party countries," Europe is like, "Okay, let's figure out how we can do that." And now you have, speaking of some of these individual members, you've got Finland's president this week saying that the security guarantees for Ukraine from this so called coalition of the willing would compel European countries that sign on to fight Russia if Moscow launched military action against Ukraine again in the future. Now, of course, he's claiming this would be a deterrent, but I mean, the entire NATO alliance, right? All of Russia's concerns that it has voiced up until this point were about avoiding something like what Europe is trying to put in place right now. So, how do you view the coalition of the willing and all of these grand ideas that they are throwing out there that would all be non starters for Russia?
Well, it's hard to understand because, as you said, all of this is completely unacceptable to Russia. So this is why Russia cited invading Ukraine to begin with, that they spent a whole decade attempting to get Ukraine to restore its neutrality. It was undermined at every turn. So from the Russian perspective, Their goal is to, well, do by force what they couldn't do through diplomacy, which is end NATO's incursion into Ukraine, reverse it, restore its neutrality. But it's unclear because the Europeans at the moment, they're not they don't want to give an inch. They suggest that any concessions would be, if they restore Ukraine's neutrality, it would be to legitimize Russian imperialism and all this. So it's not really going anywhere. And but this whole idea that they have to deter Russia as well, this is it's a very dangerous idea, because deterrence was more clear cut during the Cold War. You don't attack us, we don't attack you. But now we don't have clear dividing lines in Europe. So what we have done in terms of toppling the government in Ukraine created a situation for Russia which it considers an existential threat. And now, what does deterrence mean? It's if Russia involves itself in Ukraine and Russia considers itself to be pushing back against NATO's expansion, then we will go to war with Russia. I mean, this is the lines between offense and defense becomes very much blurred, which is a problem with the offense defense balance to begin with. But it's only becomes worse now that that we're essentially expanding and then calling for deterrence against Russia from reacting. So it's a very dangerous situation we're putting ourselves into. But this is the language you kind of need to have consensus. If you're going to have all these countries come together and agree upon essentially going to war with the largest military power in Europe and the largest nuclear power in the world, you kind of need some very normative or moralistic rhetoric in order to shame any opposition.
Yeah, it's always interesting how the West loves to do that, right? They love to carry out an attack or to do something targeting another country and then to say, oh, but you better not respond. And it's like, okay, well, we thought that deterrence existed there to begin with, especially when you're talking about NATO versus Russia. But yet, speaking of some of the comments that we're getting, you also have the president of the Czech Republic saying that NATO must respond adequately to Russian airspace violations, including potentially by shooting down Russian jets. I mean, it seems like so many of these European politicians are eager for a wider war against Russia, yet they, of course, would not be the ones going to war. It would be their population, right? Members of their public. So, how do you view the position Europe overall is in? And do you think that the public realizes just how dangerous this rhetoric is coming from their own politicians?
No, because media is very, very one-sided. There's no critical assessment, and this a large part of the problem is in any situation, if you want to reduce the security competition with Russia and promote peace, the first step is always to recognize that the opponent also has security concerns. So peace can be pursued through some compromise. But there's no discussion. No one ever has discussed the security concern of Russia or any other opponents, Iran, China. It's not done anymore. Instead, it's always assumed that they're doing bad things, and peace is created when we show strength and put them in their place. The problem now, a lot of this is happening around the Baltic Sea. This is the context which the Czech president said it would be a good idea to start shooting down Russian jets, which is this is just a horrible thing to say to begin with. Takes us to a very dangerous spot. But look at the things that have happened over the past few months. A few months ago, you had the U.S. General Chris Donahue, who's the head of the Europe Command in the U.S. Army, who made the point or the argument that we can now invade Kaliningrad, a region of Russia which is on the Baltic Sea with over 1 million people in population. And he said, oh, this can be invaded. It would be easy to take. Then you have the former NATO Secretary General Rasmussen, who was making the point that, we could put a blockade on St. Petersburg now that we have Finland and Sweden in NATO. And this general every now and then you have interviews with NATO officers in big media in the West, like Financial Times, where they're arguing that we can put more pressure on Kaliningrad now that we have the Baltic Sea, then we have them cornered, and we're calling the Baltic Sea NATO lake, all of this stuff, and then in the context of all these threats of invasions and blockades, all of this is our acts of war, of course. we see the minor reactions from the Russians. Claims that some Russian jets entered the Estonian airspace, and we pretty much suggest, oh, now, well, this is a reason for war. It's so it's so insane to begin with, and we don't even know if this is true, that there ever was any Russian jets in Estonia. Keep in mind that we just went through years and years of the Russiagate hoax, which was all fake. Then we had the Biden laptop, which was also fake. We were told this was a Russian disinformation campaign. It was not. We had the story of Russians putting bounties on the heads of American soldiers in Afghanistan. It was fake. Only now, was it 2 weeks ago, we had the main newspapers writing that Russia had scrambled or jammed the GPS signals of the flight of von der Leyen in the European Union, so the plane couldn't land for hours or something. Also fake. It has been proven to be fake. So one story after another, it's all fake, but every time these fake stories come out, the eagerness in the media and among the politicians that finally, look, we have a smoking gun how evil the Russians are. Now we have to do something. We have to step up the military pressure, sanctions. I think some healthy skepticism would be warranted. But even if the Russians did enter Estonian airspace, it has to be put in the context, even if it is true, of the escalation which is happening in the region. But none of this is happening. Every news story is just another Russian aggression happening in a vacuum. And for God's sake, we don't need any evidence at all. And if you ask for evidence, that suggests you might be taking the side of the Russians, who are saying that it's not true, and you're doubting our own people. So you're almost a traitor. I mean, the situation has become so absurd, and the warmongers have really, taken over the wheel.
Yeah, it's incredibly concerning, exactly as you're laying it out there. I'm going, the position that NATO is in and the fact that the media never questions anything. So if they say, oh, Russian jets breached Estonian airspace, the media is just typing that right up, not asking any questions. If they say, oh, Russian drones landed over the border in Poland, they're not asking, oh, how did that happen? They're just taking it at face value. And now, speaking of those sanctions, you have the EU, which has introduced its 19th sanctions package against Russia. This version includes a plan to phase out Russian liquefied natural gas purchases by the start of 2027, a year earlier than previously planned, as well as provisions meant to pressure companies from China and other nations to stop doing business with Russia. Oh, and provisions targeting cryptocurrency platforms that enable transactions within Russia. All right, we've made it to package number 19 of sanctions. How do you view this latest pressure coming mainly from the US to target these third-party countries like China and like India that still dare to do business with Russia because it's good for them, so they're going to keep doing it no matter what the US says?
Well, first, just one quick word on the wording they use in these sanctions. Like, one of the key things they want to do is target Russia's shadow fleet, and there's always this, again, if you want to listen at propaganda and the propaganda, what it does to language, this is a good indication. Ask one of these journalists who keeps writing about shadow fleet what it actually means. What is a shadow fleet? Well, it's Russian ships which are avoiding Western sanctions. This is shadow. I mean, there's all this crazy labeling. So it's what they're looking for is to go harder against Russian ships, but they make it sound as if there's some criminal enterprise, some crazy piracy. Well, regarding the U.S. Pressure on the the secondary sanctions, I think it's important to note that the Europeans are targets in this as well, because the main way that the United States is responding to this emergence of multipolarity is, and the struggle to compete properly with countries like China, is that they're seeking to pressure other countries to decouple from China and make themselves more dependent on the United States. Because when you have an asymmetrical interdependent relationship, the more dominant side gets to extract a lot of political and economic incentives. So, for example, after the Cold War, the Europeans suddenly began to pursue these ambitions. Their key objectives were European independence, strategic sovereignty, all these words which simply meant more independence from the United States. Now, this was possible. They began this only 2 months after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And the reason this was possible is because when there was no more security threat, the US couldn't convert security dependence into economic and political loyalties. So now they thought, oh, we can be a little bit more independent. Now, once this war began in Ukraine, the Europeans feel more insecure. They have to lean more on the United States. So now the US can ask them to do whatever they want. They told them, you have to cut yourself off Russia. They did. They blew up the Nord Stream. The Europeans had to pretend it was Russia. The Europeans put snapback sanctions on Iran, even though Iran was cooperating with the IEA. It doesn't really matter. They take orders, but the orders are important because when the Europeans do what the Americans say, now also, by the way, putting more sanctions on China to make Trump happy, what they think is that this will be rewarded by Washington, and now Washington will pay more attention to Europe. But all it's doing is severing Europe from the rest of the world, and as a result, making themselves more and more dependent on Washington. This isn't going to result in any better treatment. On the contrary, this is going to allow Washington to put more squeeze on the Europeans, which is why when Trump called on the Europeans to come to his golf course in Scotland to sign over whatever papers he put in front of them, they did so diligently. They all recognized that this was a horrible deal, but they took it nonetheless because they recognized, well, we really need the United States now. Well, why is that? Well, we have a war. So, but they don't try to finish the war. Instead, they want to prolong it because their fear is if the war comes to an end, the Americans will leave not just Ukraine, but they will leave Europe as well. So the Europeans have become the worst enemy, and they're trying to pull the US also deeper into this war, as they're seeing Trump wanting to decouple the United States, or at least hand it over to the Europeans. And that was one of these other provocations, the so-called attack of drones into Poland, as you mentioned. First of all, the Russians dispute that this was even them. These were decoy drones, and they argue that the Ukrainians sent them in as a false flag operation. But even if it was the Russians, what was the actual attack? Poland said that the only thing that was destroyed was one house in Poland, but that turned out to be a Polish missile, which tried to intercept something and hit a house instead. So it's fake, and this is but what? How did the Europeans react to this? Well, the first thing they did was use it as a reason for having more NATO consultations, and the Europeans were deeply disappointed that the United States didn't commit itself more to putting more pressure on Russia. And then, of course, you have this thing in Estonia. So, I can't help but be a bit suspicious after years and years of lies and years of no accountability. They say they want more US involvement, and then you have this one provocation after another. But, one after another, they're proven to be fake, like the von der Leyen plane or the drones in Poland. So I'm a bit skeptical. And it just shows that I don't think in Europe they have a strategy. It's all about getting the US more committed to a war. And best case, if it's really Christmas, the United States decides to join in on a war with Russia. Wonderful. And then we have a nuclear holocaust. I don't understand what the plan is there. It's just beyond absurd.
It really is. And exactly as you're describing it there, I'm going, okay, we saw a few weeks ago when all of the countries within the SCO came together, right? You had Russia and China and India and all of these other countries standing together saying, how can we work together? How can we make each other stronger? How can we further the multipolar world? And then you look at NATO, and it's like they're in this weird abusive relationship where Europe is over here doing whatever the US says because they think it will be better for them. But the US doesn't care, right? They don't care if what's supposed to be their closest allies are harmed by all of this because the US sees it as making them stronger. But at the end of the day, doesn't that just hurt the NATO alliance as a whole? All I'm seeing is Russia figuring out how to rely less on the West, right? Russia strengthening its partnerships with other countries, saying, okay, if you don't want to buy our resources, that's fine. There are plenty of other partners who will, versus NATO in this position where, I mean, Europe just keeps hurting itself, and the implications for its economy. I know we've kind of started to see it, but I mean, where do your concerns stand about what this is going to do to the overall European economy as they just keep throwing themselves at the US, thinking that the US is going to save them and make everything better?
Well, I don't think there's any plan at all. It's just doubling down. But the secondary sanction, what's important with them is that they're now also going after other countries. That is, any country trading with Russia, which means that the Europeans will then put more pressure on China, but also India. Now, the problem for countries like India, if they would bow to pressure and say, okay, we're not going to trade anymore with Russia, then they would grow more dependent on the US. They would probably have to buy some expensive LNG from there as well. But anyways, the main point is that wouldn't be the end of it. Once they bow to the pressure and they're more dependent on the US and the West, then we can put more demands. Well, stop trading with China, stop trading with Iran. And at the end, the Indians would also end up like the Europeans, where they excessively dependent only on one center of power, which can then begin to dictate term for preferential economic cooperation. They can begin to extract political concessions. And this is why the Indians said no. And when Trump said, "Oh, India chose Russia and China ahead of us," they didn't really actually choose any. It's just that it was only the United States that threatened India. The Chinese and Russians haven't told the Indians who they're allowed to trade with or not. There was only Washington who did this, and this is why they said no to Washington, because they want to be an independent country. They want to be able to trade with whomever they want. So if the United States want to have good trading relations with India, they would be happy. That's why they're not burning any bridges, but they're not going to be told what to do. I mean, that part of history is over. So no, but I don't understand Europe. At least the Americans, it makes sense. They're seeing the Ukraine war being lost. They're dumping it on the Europeans and making the Europeans pay for it as well. They're getting the money back from Zelensky. It kind of makes sense. But for the Europeans, they're just going down this one-way street, doubling down without any plan B. Meanwhile, their economies are deindustrializing quickly. They're paying many times more for energy, which won't be very reliable in the future. Their debt is out of control. We're having a crisis in political legitimacy, as obviously people don't support the leaderships. And what do we do when the opposition comes, which wants an end to the war? Well, you just have to cancel the opposition. Like the largest opposition party now in Germany, actually the most popular party there is in Germany, is AfD. And they labeled it an extremist organization and being now targeted by the intelligence services, and it could be banned as well. In France, they arrested Le Pen, who was the main opposition. In Romania, they reversed the election results once they voted the wrong way. In the Czech Republic, the president who now wants to shoot down Russian planes argued that if Babis wins the election and becomes prime minister, he will block him from taking the position because, and there was a quote, he had an ambiguous relationship with NATO. So he hasn't committed himself properly to NATO. So there is no more, you can't vote your way out of this anymore. So it's everything is going very quickly. It's falling apart very quickly. And there's no plan B. It's just continue down the same path, which is taking us, I guess, to a very dangerous place.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. And it's, you're watching as exactly as you're describing it. It's not, oh, we're just waiting for some sort of political opposition to rise up. No, when they do rise up, then they are targeted. The media continues to play a role in it. Now, while I have you here, there's one more thing I wanted to bring up, and I really appreciate your time today. We did hear from Russian President Putin earlier today at a meeting of the Russian Security Council, and he said there that, hey, Russia is ready and willing to extend the New START treaty, which is, of course, the last remaining nuclear treaty between the US and Russia. He also warned that Russia is ready to respond to any threat. So, how do you view the position that Russia is in currently, as everything that NATO is communicating to them is that there is not going to be an end to this overall proxy war anytime soon?
Well, I guess a key concern for Russia is over the past 3.5 years, every time it appears that that Ukraine begins to collapse, or the front line begins to collapse, NATO has responded by escalating, that is, sending more powerful weapons. I always make the point that even Joe Biden once pointed out that sending F-16s would mean World War III. Now we're sending missiles, which is often operated by NATO soldiers, which are used to launch these missiles deep into Russian cities. So this is, we moved very far away from this. So my point is, every time there's an escalation, the Russians have to choose: do they strike back in a similar way, that is, target NATO, but that could trigger World War III, or do they take one on the chin and just continue going along? But then they risk emboldening NATO. Well, a key criticism within Russia towards Putin now is that they embolden NATO, and now they're having the Europeans openly talking about sending missiles to strike Russian cities. This was unthinkable only 3.5 years ago. So there is a sentiment that if they continue to escalate, for example, the Germans sending Taurus missiles, then the time has come to strike Germany as well. I mean, the Germans keep saying, why should the war be limited to Ukraine? We have to bring the war to Russia. Well, why should it be limited to Russia? Maybe Russia will bring it to Germany. This is their sentiment, but it should be common sense. Anyways, we're reaching a very difficult point now. That is, as you said, the Ukrainian front lines are collapsing very fast. Everyone's now recognizing that they can't replenish the troops. The whole Ukraine war chant, Ukraine is winning chant has also come to an end. Anyone half serious recognizes that we're reaching the end game. So what happens if the Ukraine army collapses? Will we accept a painful compromise? No, we're not even going to sit down and talk to the Russians. That's considered immoral. So for that reason, the only card to play is escalation. So I think seeing what is coming, which is another escalation, talking about shooting down Russian jets or jamming them or anything like this, Russia has made the argument now that they will be prepared to respond and retaliate. So I think this final stage of the war will be extremely dangerous, and I wish there was some professional, mature leadership to take us through this dangerous time. But again, I don't see any trace of it.
Yeah, it's very concerning when you look at what are supposed to be the leaders and they're talking about shooting down Russian jets or sending European troops into Ukraine, because it is a reminder that they do not plan on there ever being any kind of lasting peace. And Russia is listening and hearing those warnings loud and clear. I know that there is certainly a lot at stake here all around, and I really appreciate you taking the time to join me today to break down all of the latest here. Glenn Diesen, a geopolitical analyst, author, and professor at the University of South-Eastern Norway. Thank you so much for your time and insight.
Thank you.
If anything in this video resonated with you, be sure to like it, share it with your friends, leave a comment, and as always, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to keep up with all of my work, make sure that you're subscribed to my page on Substack. That's rachelblevins.substack.com. That's where you'll find ad-free videos and new weekly episodes of my exclusive series for paid subscribers called Sanctioned. You can also check out Sanctioned over on my page on Patreon. That's patreon.com/RachelBlevins. As always, thank y'all so much for all of your support, and I'll see you next time.